Hey, my name's Rachael Johnson. I'm a scholar of early modern European religious history, focusing on Iberia, and I'm excited to introduce you to El Greco, who is one of the most prominent and distinctive artists of the early modern period. He's known to us primarily by his Spanish nickname, El Greco, which means the Greek, because he is from Crete, which was part of the Venetian Empire at the time. He was born in 1541, was trained in Byzantine iconography, and then moved to Venice, where he became trained in and acquainted with high Renaissance masters and the nascent Mannerist movement. He is so distinctive in part because he's hard to categorize. You can usually spot an El Greco a mile away, even when it's early on in his career, like this painting, the Pietà. It still has the kind of trademark El Greco color palette with this otherworldly, silvery, pale blues and grays that often characterize his complexions of the subjects he paints, in this kind of dissonant contrast with these rich jewel-like greens and yellows and reds and blues, and it creates a really fascinating color combination. He's also known for his elongated serpentine figures, borrowing from the Mannerist movement, but kind of with his own twist. He was a master of emotional expression, especially in his portraits. And while he met with mixed success at the time, he didn't really secure many prominent commissions. He was popular in certain circles and has had an enormous impact on modern artists of the 20th century, like Edgar Degas and Cézanne, and especially Picasso. This painting is a Pietà, which is a medieval artistic tradition of depicting the moment between the crucifixion and the burial of Christ. And it usually depicts Mary, sometimes flanked by other figures like Mary Magdalene or John, as it is in this case, and usually highlights Mary's mourning. The most iconic Pietà is Michelangelo's that we see in St. Peter's Basilica, where it has a very serene Mary cradling the dead body of Christ in her lap. But this one is actually inspired by a lesser-known Pietà by Michelangelo called the Bandini Pietà, which he sculpted for his own tomb at the end of his life. And in that version, it's very similar. We see the inspiration here in a kind of collapsed and broken Christ with a twisted body being supported by other figures. But there's some really fascinating differences here between Michelangelo's version and El Greco's. First of all, Michelangelo's version has John at the top of the pyramidal scheme, supporting the body of Christ, flanked by Mary Magdalene and the mother, Mary. Here we have Mary at the top of the pyramidal scheme. And she's not only at the top, she is supporting the bodies, really, of all three of the other figures. You see John kind of clutching her shoulder for support as he is buckling under the weight of Christ. You have Mary Magdalene, very muscular and strong, but with tender hands supporting Christ and also kind of leaning on Mary. It's a fascinating, to me, depiction that's also reflecting the prominence that Mary had in this time period. Just a few years before this painting, in 1574, you had the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571, which was the kind of cultural turning point in the battle between the Christian West and the Ottoman East, as they were battling over some outpost in Cyprus, an eastern Greek island. Pope Pius V had rallied these southern Catholic entities. They claimed Mary as their protector and patron, and against all the odds, demolished the Ottoman navy and went on to victory. Pope Pius proclaimed Mary as the reason for their victory, and there was a Europe-wide procession to the Lady of Victory. And so I think it's really telling that just a few years later we have this depiction of a very strong, supportive, protective Mary. Aside from that, you still see the kind of classic, distinctive El Greco's color palette and a very poignant expression of anguish on Mary's face, again in distinction to Michelangelo's more serene, kind of composed countenance. This is, to me, actually quite similar to El Greco's later version of Lacan, where you see the kind of anguished and more expressive faces in the characters here. And here we come to the other beautiful El Greco piece we have that we're hosting here. This one is painted a few decades later when El Greco has moved on from Venice, Rome, and now has established himself in Toledo, which becomes his kind of adopted homeland. This is a gorgeous painting of Saint Jerome. And I love this painting for kind of two different layered reasons. One is the straightforward one, and the other is kind of the meta. We see this depiction of Saint Jerome, who was an early church father and theologian from the 4th century, most well known for translating and producing the Latin Vulgate Bible, which was the official Bible used by the church throughout the Middle Ages, and then became reaffirmed in the Council of Trent as the Bible in use by the Catholic Church. He was also well known for his asceticism. Apparently he was a raucous youth in Rome, and as part of his conversion experience spent several years in ascetic practices in the Syrian desert. And so often depictions of Saint Jerome are either as him as a scholar in his library with his books, doing his translations and his theological writings, or as an ascetic. And here we have Saint Jerome as the penitent. El Greco did do other versions of Saint Jerome in his other roles. But here we see Saint Jerome with all of the trappings of asceticism. He is clutching a rock in his hand with which he would flagellate or beat himself. We have him bare from the waist up with his cardinal hat hung behind him, showing the role in which he is filling right now as a spiritual supplicant and as a humble believer and follower of Christ, as opposed to his more prestigious roles. We have the Latin Vulgate Bible in front of him, and also some symbols of the kind of vanitas genre that would become very prominent in this century. We have the hourglass, signaling the passage of time, the skull reminding you of mortality and death. And most prominently, you have Saint Jerome holding a crucifix. And here's where I think it becomes a really classic piece of Counter-Reformation art. Not only do we see Saint Jerome in this gaze of adoration towards the crucifix, but this in and of itself is an enactment of the Council of Trent's attitudes towards religious art. The depiction of religious images was a very contentious issue throughout Christian history. You have the Byzantine iconoclastic controversies. You have it erupting again with the Protestant Reformation, especially with some of the more radical reformers who considered any depictions of religious figures or saints as bordering on or absolute instances of idolatry. And the Council of Trent was a series of sessions that pulled together leading theologians and Catholic leaders to establish and respond to Protestant criticisms and establish their own doctrines, and one of those being the importance of religious art. In the last Council of Trent, session 25, in 1563, a few decades before this, the council decreed that religious art was vital. They clarify that the bishops shall teach that by means of the histories of our redemption, as portrayed in paintings and other representations, the people is instructed and confirmed in the habit of remembering the articles of faith and the great profit that is derived from all sacred images, not only because the people thereby are admonished of the benefits and gifts bestowed upon them by Christ and the miracles which God has performed by the saints, and their salutary examples are set before the eyes of the faithful, so that they may order their own lives and manners in imitation of the saints, and be excited to adore and love God and to cultivate piety. So not only is the viewer being kind of inspired by this depiction of a penitent and humble, adoring Saint Jerome, but he himself is modeling how art can act that way as he beholds a crucifix, that in turn is inspiring him and cultivating in him a very intimate piety with Christ. And so it is a very Counter-Reformation piece of art, showing the impact and the ability of art to move, inspire, instruct, not only for those who are viewing, but as a joining a kind of chain of reactions that connect the viewer to Saint Jerome, who is experiencing the same thing himself. These El Grecos are on display at the MOA until June 15th, and I encourage you to come enjoy them and explore them and sit with them.